because of how much love I have for the Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown after playing the game multiple times, I've decided to do a ranking video on the boss fights of the game. More specifically, I'm taking a look at which ones were the most difficult to beat on my first playthrough. Each of the boss fights on this list, I found myself dying to multiple times, and honestly, it became a process of trial and error until I found that secret to beating each of these tough opponents. Sure, once you learn the trick, most of them become a lot easier to deal with in the second encounters, but again, for this video, we're looking at our first playthrough of the game. And since some of the bosses in this game are massive spoilers, I would recommend playing the game first prior to watching this, or if you don't care about being spoiled, then have at it, I guess. Before we start today's video though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a like on today's video. Also, for those of you that want to go above and beyond with supporting the channel, then you can become a STARS member by joining the program on the channel by clicking that join button. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 hardest boss fights of the Lost Crown. Let's get it. Number 10, Jahandar.
Your life ends here.
The Lost Crown starts off the game with a major boss fight against a general, and then is followed up by a ton of mini bosses that are similar to other regular enemies throughout the rest of the game. However, your first tough boss fight is against Jahandar. Up until this point, you've probably only struggled against Erlik a little and maybe the Undead Prisoner, but next to this giant lion with a scorpion stinger for a tail, they all pale in comparison. From being able to poison the ground that you walk on, forcing you to slide out of the way, to it charging at you with its horn, which forces you to use your parry to counter it. The Jahandar will keep you on your toes. It might be at the bottom of today's list, but don't underestimate this beast, as it can be quite challenging since up until now you've probably felt pretty good about yourself and your skills in combat. Number 9, the Jailor. The Jailor is unique in many ways compared to other boss fights on this list. For one, it's the only boss fight here that doesn't have a large visible health bar. Plus, it's technically the only optional boss fight that cracks the top 10 hardest bosses in the Lost Crown. But most notably, it's a boss fight that requires you to battle it in a specific realm using your recently acquired ability of clairvoyance. That's because in the regular dimension, you are unable to damage him. So logically, you would assume that staying in the alternate dimension would be the best way to deal with him. Well, that's not so simple either. Another aspect of this fight that is different from most boss fights in the game is that the Jailor can summon regular enemies. And while you can only damage him in the alternate dimension, the regular enemies can only be hurt in the normal world. So you have to switch back and forth to deal with both the Jailor and his minions, which could provide quite the headache. Sure, he doesn't have as much health as other bosses in the game, but he does provide the most irritating fight thanks to his friends on the other side. Number 8, alternate Sargon.
Another. We were one and the same. Only I chose a different path. I don't understand. Time no longer flows like a river. It's a raging sea where all fates are intertwined.
There are a few recurring boss fights in the Lost Crown, but one of the most notable ones are the alternate Sargons. Exactly as the name implies, these guys are essentially different Sargons from different timelines who are trying to defeat you in order to steal your powers. The first time you encounter one, you'll definitely be caught off guard as he'll have all the same abilities as you do. From your melee combos to your surge abilities, these guys will challenge you to basically be an AI with the same arsenal as you. Thankfully, only one fight against alternate Sargon is mandatory, but if you find yourself going for that 100% trophy, then you'll come face to face with taking on 2 of them at the same time. Since they pretty much use all the same abilities as you, the more familiar you become with your own skills, the more recognizable their movements will be. Still, because they are some of the fastest bosses in the game, you'll find yourself struggling to keep up and damage them. Number 7, Orod.
I, Orod, the Storm Master, challenge Sargon, the Betrayer.
Okay, so I did give you guys a spoiler warning at the start of this video, and this is one of the reasons. At some point of the game, you'll find Sargon at odds with most of the immortals, and therefore he's forced to fight against some of them. Despite his size though, Orod is actually the least difficult out of all the immortals that Sargon faces. Now don't get me wrong, saying Orod is the easiest immortal to beat is like saying an Olympic swimmer is the slowest on the team. Orod the Stormmaster taunts Sargon into meeting him across the sea, where the two face off against each other on a shipwreck. Phase 1 is pretty easy to deal with, but thanks to him splitting his anchor-like weapon in half, creating two long-range blades attached to chains, Orod can reach across the entire battlefield without moving an inch. Luckily, a lot of his attacks are slower compared to some of the other boss fights in the game, so it's a little easier to predict which attack he'll do, and therefore it becomes easier to dodge him. Still, he can deal out a considerable amount of damage with each attack, especially the one where he swings his blade around the entire area, and if he hits you, it's a full-blown kicking your ass montage. Some of his attacks require you to use time abilities to avoid them, like the twisters that he sends across the battlefield. Plus, since you've already mastered this technique in other fights prior to this shouldn't be as big of a problem as it was for some of the other entries on this list. Even so, when fighting against Orod, all it takes is one mistake and you'll find your health drained before you can even say oops. Number 6, Kiana.
Don't leave so soon. I'm always in need of new servants.
Kiana is probably the boss fight that I died the most to, mainly because of my lack of understanding Sargon's abilities. It wasn't until this fight that I started to use counters more and had to force myself to be better about timing dodges. However, thanks to Kiana being fairly early in the game compared to most of the bosses on this list, I barely raised my health level, making it that much more difficult to beat her. If I remember correctly, I only had 4 bars of health, which meant that Kiana could easily destroy me if she managed to land one of her powerful attacks. Add that to the speed that her and her big bad wolf had, and I found myself overwhelmed for the first time in the game. Probably the biggest pain when dealing with her is that she teleports us to a different world. From here, it's literally hell as Kiana begins a never-ending barrage of attacks that will mess you up badly if you can't get the right rhythm of dodging each blow. As she gets closer to death, she becomes more aggressive during the fight and even throws 2 attacks at you at the same exact time, giving you a very small window to dodge. Because of her speed, the fact that you have to watch 2 enemies at once, and the variety of different attacks, Kiana easily cracks the list of being one of the hardest boss fights of the Lost Crown. Number 5, King Darius.
I knew this day would come. To rise once more. Protect my son.
Despite being the body of a human being, King Darius is one of the tallest opponents that Sargon will face off against, and he poses a major challenge to any player looking to beat the Lost Crown, especially on harder difficulties. Because of his size, trying to dodge his attacks is a lot like trying to dodge fire while trapped in a barn full of hay. Sure, phase 1 of the fight is definitely one of the easiest phase 1 for a boss fight throughout the entire game, but when King Darius goes full Game of Thrones on our asses and begins to use both fire and ice to deal damage, then you begin to regret mocking his first phase. Similar to what I said about Orod, King Darius can pretty much reach across the entire battlefield with his fire and ice abilities. Actually, he's a boss that will literally force you to stay in the air non-stop or face the consequences for touching the ground. Thankfully, this is a little easier to do than normal boss fights because this time you have your new grappling ability. Even in the air though, Darius can catch you off guard with a few different attacks. One of which he creates a circle of fire, which is then followed by an attack that's delivered in the form of a cross. The problem with this attack is that it leaves you a very small window to dodge, as it pretty much requires you to stay within one of 4 different small areas within the circle. Unfortunately, this isn't even his most brutal attack, as he has one of those kick-ass montages that most boss fights have. But his attack is definitely one of the hardest ones to dodge. First, he covers the ground with fire. Then he targets you from different angles, forcing you to grapple hook your way across the field and throw you off your balance. Then finally, he cuts through the center of the stage, which forces you to get above or below his attack without going too low and getting burned. If he hits you with that last blow, then prepare to see fire and ice come together for one massive Kamehameha attack. Number 4, Vahram, final fight.
Be the first to witness the birth of a new world, Sargon.
It feels wrong putting the final boss of the game outside of the top 3, but honestly, he's not as dangerous as he appears to be on paper. Before I get to why he's not higher up on this list, let's take a look at what makes him the 4th hardest boss in the game. First off, he's the only boss that you have to defeat 4 times in a row. Each phase changes his attacks and makes him way more aggressive, with the last phase being a little easier than the second and third in my opinion. The final fight against Vahram brings out all sorts of attacks that are meant to challenge you and all of your new abilities that you have learned on your journey. From catching fireballs with your dimensional rift to using a time clone to avoid the onslaught of blades coming down on you, you'll need to use every ability that you have at your disposal to beat him. Each time you kill him, you'll have to then destroy an orb that appears over Vahram's human body. After which, he'll grow more aggressive than the time before. One of the hardest attacks to dodge is when he shoots lasers across the battlefield, and then you have to quickly find a safe area before he activates them. But considering that we've seen this attack done before in a different fight with Vahram, this should come easier this time around. He does have a super attack that leads to one of those kick-ass montages, but unlike most of the ones that came before, his is actually fairly easy to read and avoid. The real struggle with beating him and why he's so far up on this list comes down to one word: endurance. As I said earlier, you have to take him down back to back 4 times in a row. What that means is that you have to make whatever supply of healing potions you have available last throughout the entire fight against him. But as long as you are patient with each attack and prioritize your own safety versus getting additional hits in, then this shouldn't be too big of a problem. Plus, the 4th and final resurrection of Vahram flips things around as you're given some pretty overpowered abilities to completely wreck him, thus making the 4th phase kind of irrelevant. Number 3, Azhdaha. Fuck this snake. Enough said. Azhdaha, or however the hell you pronounce this reptile straight from hell, is the boss you face off against after entering the pit of eternal sands. Remember when I said that King Darius is one of the tallest enemies in the game? Well, meet the indisputable champion of that title. Yeah, King Cobra over here is so big that a majority of his body hides out in the background for most of his attacks. And get this, you are missing a few abilities that would definitely make this fight a lot more easier if you had them, most notably the double jump ability. Since you don't get it until after beating him, you're stuck with dashing to stay above some of his attacks, which stretch across the entire battlefield. But the most annoying attack to deal with is his super move. While most times you'll be motivated to counter them to deal major damage to the boss, against him I found myself just trying to avoid getting hit by it. That's because he does a cheap shot. Unlike most bosses in the game, he does a double swipe, one with his tail and one with his fangs. The fangs attack are the ones that you must counter, but considering that the tail sweep comes just before, getting the timing of dodging the first sweep and then countering that attack is a lot easier said than done. Most of the time, it led to him blasting me to outer space. Even trying to dodge this attack without double jumping is hard, as the first attack is a sweep on the ground level while the second attack is slightly higher, making it one of the most destructible and hard to dodge special attacks in the game. If it wasn't for 2 more boss fights that came after this one later in the game that were more difficult overall, then I would have said that this was easily the hardest boss in the Lost Crown. Unfortunately, my troubles with him were nothing compared to these next 2 entries. Number 2, Vahram, second fight.
The feathers of the Simorgh were never meant for you, nor any mortal. The Simorgh is no more. Its powers are mine, and mine alone.
One thing that I failed to mention when talking about the final boss fight of the game is that Vahram was actually more difficult to beat the last time we faced off against him. Sure, we didn't have 4 lives to deal with, but he sure as hell had more difficult attacks to dodge, and honestly, I would argue that he was much faster to some extent. The second time that we faced off against Vahram is basically the first fight over again, only this time we're supposed to win. Just like with most boss fights in the game, it starts off with a fairly easy phase 1, since in this segment of the fight you basically get a clone of you as an ally in this fight. Unfortunately, that's very brief, as the moment you hit 75% of his health left, Vahram knocks out your other self and becomes way more aggressive. Something that we don't see Vahram use much of in his final fight against him outside of resurrecting himself, is the ability to rewind time. At random points throughout this battle, Vahram can use his time manipulation power to basically heal some of his health while also putting himself in a position to counterattack you. Thankfully, as long as you deal some sort of damage to him, he'll stop healing. However, there are 3 attacks that are brutal to deal with, which ultimately plays a major part as to why he's the second hardest boss in the game. The first is his ability to slow down time in a specific area. If you are caught in this bubble, then SOL, because you'll be unable to move quick enough to dodge his attacks, and he usually follows up this ability with a massive combo. The second frustrating attack is his aerial denial ability, which comes in 1 of 3 forms depending on the phase. Basically, he'll create circles on the battlefield in different areas, and falling into one of these bubbles will deal some damage. Well, first, it's fairly easy to dodge. In phase 3, if you're caught close to him when he uses it, there's a very tiny window of safety available to you. The final and most frustrating attack to deal with is something that he actually uses in his final form, his laser attack. Only this time it can be much more deadly. Sure, in the final fight against him, he usually does it 3 times back to back, followed by a super move. However, if you get caught in those lasers, then you only receive some damage. This time around, if you get caught in his lasers, then you automatically get thrown into his super attack. And let me tell you, it's not pretty. Number 1, Menolias.
Vahram is the king to end all wars.
A king would not kill his subjects. Help me stop him.
Vahram has an ideal that is bigger than you and me. You're giving me no choice.
For me, the title for the hardest boss in Prince of Persia, The Lost Crown, goes to the immortal archer, Menolias. I'll be honest, this choice probably won't match most people's list, and that's okay, but hear me out on this for a moment. Personally, Menolias is the most annoying and frustrating boss to deal with, and really, it can be summed up in 3 key traits: range attacks, counter attacks, and speed. Menolias' primary weapon is of course his bow, but don't let that fool you. He's as dangerous in close range as he is in long range. Still, one of the most frustrating factors to dealing with Menolias in his boss fight comes from the fact that he's intelligent enough to keep at a distance from you. A majority of this fight will be a cat and mouse game, as he'll constantly keep moving and jumping from one side of the field to the other, all the while he's firing a barrage of arrows at you or tossing his boomerang chakra at you to deal damage. Because of this, dealing damage to him is extremely difficult, and you could easily find yourself panicking out of frustration. And when you add the fact that he's easily one of the fastest opponents in the game, then you'll find catching him to be one of the most difficult things you have to do in the Lost Crown. Even if you do manage to catch up to Menolias, he has a few abilities that'll catch you off guard in his back pocket. Most boss fights have a single special attack, but Menolias has 2, one of which works as a counter attack. Because of his speed, you'll find yourself chasing him across the map and trying to land as many attacks as possible. Unfortunately, this strategy could easily backfire, as he sometimes will use a counter, and if you hit him when he's using that ability, he'll activate his special attack. He can also charge at you on the ground with a melee special attack. With these attacks, plus his range abilities, Menolias becomes the perfect opponent to Sargon. He's a professional with both his fists and his bow, making him the most difficult boss fight in the game. But that's it for today's episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know which boss fight in the Lost Crown gave you the most difficult time. Was it Menolias? Was it Vahram? Or was it someone else completely? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more ranking videos, like this one, and leave a like on this video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.